All right, so welcome back. So this is part three in our bone lecture, and so here we're going to talk about some different types of cells that we can expect to find in our bones. And so we talked about in one of the previous parts of this lecture the idea of marrow. And we talked about red marrow, and we talked about yellow marrow. So red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. So we said that red bone marrow is made up of marrow cells that are responsible for producing our blood cells. Okay, so we say here specifically the site of red blood cell production, but it is really in general our blood cells in general, right? So that includes red blood cells, so erythrocytes, but that also includes leukocytes or white blood cells, as well as thrombocytes or platelets, right? And we said that they are all derived from that common hematopoietic stem cell, sometimes referred to as a hemocytoblast, all right? Now, the second type of marrow is yellow bone marrow. So yellow bone marrow is different. It doesn't have anything to do with um, with the production of blood cells, but it's largely a site of fat storage, right? And then we can pull on that fat um, for energy needs if necessary. So when we're younger, we primarily have, and remember this yellow bone marrow is found in the medullary cavity of the diaphysis. So the long shaft of the bone, that's where we can expect to find the yellow marrow. So in children and in young infants, we largely have red marrow, red bone marrow in the medullary cavity, where later on in adulthood we would expect to find yellow bone marrow, right? And this is because when we're young and we're actively growing, we need increased blood cell requirements because we're actively growing and we're producing lots and lots of blood. So it makes sense that we would have more red marrow there as opposed to yellow bone marrow. Now, as we get older, as we progress into childhood, as we progress into adolescence, and then ultimately adulthood, we slowly begin replacing the red marrow with yellow bone marrow. So we progressively have more fat in the medullary cavity as opposed to red bone marrow, which is again responsible for the blood cell production. So as we get into adulthood, we've essentially replaced most, if not all, of the medullary cavity with yellow bone marrow, and we only retain a little bit of red marrow toward the ends of the bones in those regions known as the epiphyses, right? So in this image up here, we're only really retaining it up here in the ends, whereas in the middle, in the diaphysis and the medullary cavity, it's primarily going to be yellow bone marrow, right? Now, we can have red bone marrow in adults, as we said. Um, it's not completely gone, but we have it in very specific regions, right? So in lots of the regions of our appendicular skeleton, so that which makes up the midline axis of the body, so skull, ribs, and whatnot, vertebrae, you have it there. And you also have it in the proximal ends of some of our long bones. So proximal ends of the humerus, proximal ends of the femur as well. And then you can see an adult relative to a child, we largely have red marrow populating everywhere in young infants and young children, right? And then again, as we age, as we grow into later childhood, adolescence, and ultimately adulthood, we begin replacing that red marrow with yellow marrow, okay? Now, there are instances in which we can go backwards. We can go from yellow marrow to red bone marrow if we are experiencing from something known as anemia. So an anemia in general is a decreased ability to carry oxygen for some reason, right? And so if we have that, whether it's iron deficiency anemia or sickle cell anemia or pernicious anemia, whatever it may be, we can take some of that yellow bone marrow and revert it back to red. So usually we take red marrow and we replace it with yellow. In this case, we could take the yellow marrow and replace it with red, and that allows us it gives us a greater capacity to produce blood cells. If we have more blood cells, theoretically, we can carry more oxygen, and there we have corrected the anemia issue. All right. So here you can see some different bone cells, and these are the bone cells that we're going to progress into looking at next. All right, so we'll look at the derivatives of these hematopoietic stem cells, specifically three main types: osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. All right, and we'll see how they're organized, how they're arranged, and what their general functions are. All right, so the first type is an osteoprogenitor cell. This is the kind of stem cell, if you will, that's going to be undergoing mitosis. So it's mitotically active, it's rapidly dividing, and it will give rise to our osteoblasts. All right. So if you look at the term osteoprogenitor, the term osteo means cell, the term pro is meaning before, and then genitor means generation or the production of. All right. So this is the cell, the bone cell that is giving rise to all of the new cells, right? So the bone cell that is producing all these later ones, right? And one cell that it produces is the osteoblast, right? So if we look at the osteoblast, think of the ending blast. Blast, think build, okay? So the blast cells are those that are responsible for actually building the bone, and they lay down material that contribute to bone growth, right? And so what they do is they lay down collagen fibers, and these collagen fibers are then able to be organized into specific structures known as osteons, and the osteons are what help to make our bones strong, and they're these kind of circular concentric structures that we'll look at in just a little bit. Okay, and so bone in general, as we kind of go on talking about it, it's made of a couple of things. One, it's made of collagen fibers. It's also made of something called hydroxyapatite crystals. And both of these things together, the hydroxyapatite crystals and the collagen fibers, give bone its different characteristics. One characteristic gives bone its hardness. So the hydroxyapatite crystals, which are made of calcium, give bone its hardness, and then the other part, the collagen fibers, give bone its tensile strength, so allows it to kind of twist to some degree and resist stretching. All right, so you need both of these qualities of bones. You need it to be able to be hard, one, so it doesn't just shatter, but you also need it to be able to somewhat withstand twisting, somewhat withstand stretching, and be somewhat flexible, and this is called tensile strength. All right, so the osteoblasts are going to be secreting this collagen fiber, and they'll also secrete something called osteoid. All right, an osteoid is essentially unmineralized bone. So before the bone is mineralized with the calcium and these hydroxyapatite crystals, it's referred to as osteoid. All right. It also has the collagen fibers there. Now, as the osteoblasts continue to build and produce this osteoid and lay down the collagen fibers, they eventually surround themselves with what they're producing. All right. And so when they produce this and they surround themselves with this osteoid and the collagen fibers and whatnot, they change their name to osteocyte. Right. So if we look at osteocyte now, osteocytes are osteoblast derived. Okay, they're osteoblast derived. And the osteocytes can monitor and maintain the state of the bone. Okay, so they can act as sensors to respond to what type of stressors, what type of stress and mechanical activity is being applied to the bone, and then relay this information to the osteoblast and the next cell that we'll talk about, osteoclast, and then the osteoblast and clast can lay down new bone, or they can resorb and take away bone. All right. Now the osteocyte, we said that it becomes trapped. It becomes trapped in this space, okay, in this opening, and this is called a lacuna, okay, or a lacunae. All right. If you're talking about multiple. So here you see, if we look here, this cell, this purple cell, this is the osteocyte, and the space that it's in, you can see that it's kind of within this hollow space. The space is called the lacuna. All right, so the cell kind of molds to the shape, it molds to the shape of the lacunae, and it becomes trapped there. All right, but the important thing is osteocytes are derived from osteoblasts. All right, and then the last cell here are osteoclasts. So we said that B means to build. It means to build up. I think of C, classed, the class part, the C there. I think of the word catastrophe. And so if if something's a catastrophe, it falls down, it all falls apart. So an osteoclast is responsible for breaking down the bone, and this is called bone resorption. Okay. Now this is not bone reabsorption. This is called bone resorption. All right. It does this through the action of different enzymes as well as hydrochloric acid. right? So if you look over to this image here, uh, the um, the osteoclasts have this region called a ruffled border, and it's because the border of their cell looks very ruffled. It's very convoluted, and they secrete these enzymes, these bone resorbing enzymes and hydrochloric acid onto the surface of the bone. And as it does it, it breaks up the bone matrix and it releases calcium and it releases phosphate. And then that calcium and phosphate could potentially go back into the um, uh, blood if we're needing to adjust blood calcium levels or whatever the case may be. Okay, so they have these um, large borders here. They typically are multinucleated as well, so they have multiple nuclei. And we'll talk later about different hormones that can influence the activity of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Specifically, one's called calcitonin and one's called parathyroid hormone. Okay, now speaking kind of here of osteoclasts and breaking down bone and releasing calcium, this is important for a number of reasons. One, in a clinical setting, um, you will learn if you're going for nursing or medicine or something that there are specific ions in the body, so electrolytes, calcium and sodium and potassium and whatnot, and these have very specific homeostatic ranges, meaning there is a set level or a range for calcium. And for calcium, it's somewhere around 8.5 to 10 or 10.2 milligrams per deciliter. And so depending on where that level is in the blood, you have to adjust the amount of calcium. So say the number becomes too low. So normal is 8.5 to 10.2. Say we get down to 7.5 or 7. We're too low. So we have to do a couple of things. One, we can increase how much calcium we're absorbing in the GI tract, so from what we're eating. And we can also stimulate the activity of osteoclasts. By stimulating osteoclasts, we're breaking down bone. By breaking down bone, you release calcium, and that calcium can go into the blood and help adjust and help raise our blood calcium levels. Okay, so the last thing here I'll say about osteoclasts, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, is these are not derived from the same cells as or the same precursor cell as osteoblast and osteocyte. So we talked about that hematopoietic stem cell. Um, that is the cell that ultimately gives rise to um, this osteoclast. The other ones, osteocytes and osteoblasts, are derived from the osteoprogenitor cell, right? So this osteoclast, this is ultimately derived from an immune cell. All right, the same cell that makes up macrophages, which is a type of a cell in our immune system. That's what gives rise to this osteoclast, not the same precursor cell that gives rise to osteoblasts and osteocytes. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so you can see here we have these cells: osteoclasts, osteoblasts, osteocytes. You notice that the osteocytes are more embedded within the bone. And again, you have these different parts to the bone, all right? So you have what's called an organic part of the bone, and you have what's called an inorganic part of the bone, right? The organic part is primarily made up of collagen fibers as well as these cells that we just talked about, right? The collagen fibers, which is a type of protein, as we've mentioned before, this gives the bone some flexibility, some distensibility, allows it to withstand compression and some stretching. Okay, now the inorganic part, this is what's made up of the crystals. Okay, the calcium and phosphate minerals that come together and make this product or this crystal called hydroxyapatite. This hydroxyapatite, this is what gives bone its hardness. Okay, so it allows it to resist compression, and that's the inorganic part. All right, so you have to have both of these. You have to have the hard inorganic material, the hydroxyapatite crystals, plus the more malleable, more flexible collagen fibers that allow the bone to be able to withstand compression, twisting, stretch, things like that. Okay. All right. Now, we'll get into this more later, but we'll see that there's a process of bone remodeling in which you have bone, you have the taking away of bone, and then you have the reversal part. So where you start to lay down new bone with osteoblasts, the osteoblasts become trapped and become osteocytes, and so on and so forth. All right, and so we'll get into this later we'll talk about bone remodeling. We'll talk specifically about the process of ossification and how we make bone. All right. So when looking specifically at osteoblasts, we said that these are secreting a collagen matrix. Okay, so these are what are secreting part of the organic part of the bone, and the collagen makes up something known as osteoid. Okay, and the osteoid is partially some fluid, it's some other proteins, and it's collagen fibers as well that are secreted by these osteoblasts. Okay, so depending on where or what's going on in bone, if we're needing to grow bone, if we're needing to resorb and take away bone, you can have these cells kind of functioning in varying degrees of activity. um, and remember, you go from an osteoprogenitor cell to an osteoblast, and then as that osteoblast begins to secrete its products, it will become trapped in the kind of extracellular matrix that it secretes outside the cell, and it will change name from an osteoblast to an osteocyte. So that's what we're talking about right here. It'll ossify, the osteoblast becomes trapped and will transform into an osteocyte. All right. Now, as we're making this bone, we can also make bone in response to physical activity. All right. And this is a thing known as Wolff's Law. All right. So Wolff's Law is describing how bones adapt and how bones change in response to having physical and mechanical stress placed upon them. All right. And so it turns out that the more stress and the more force you put on a bone, you increase the activity of osteoblasts. And by increasing activity of osteoblasts, you actually end up laying down more bone. So the bones become thicker, they become stronger, and they're able to withstand more and more force. All right. The same thing is true if you are not as active. So say you're not walking around a lot, you're not putting a lot of compression and a lot of force on your bones, the osteoblast activity goes down, the osteoblast activity goes down, the osteoclast activity increases, and we start pulling from the bone. So in other words, if we're not using our bones, our body senses that and says, okay, all this calcium that's in the bone, we're going to pull it, and now we can use it elsewhere. We're going to use it in the blood for blood calcium levels, or for clotting, or for the transmission of electrical signals, whatever it may be. We're going to pull it, so that means that now our bone is going to become weaker. It's going to become thinner as a result of the lack of activity. Okay, so you can see here in the middle, this is normal bone, not a whole lot of activity, but not no activity, so just normal. And as we place compressive force, if we have more force, we have an increase in osteoblast activity, and we add this region of bone. So this purple here, this is a region of growth. This is what we've added to the bone. So the bone has become thicker, and by virtue of becoming thicker, the bone has become stronger. Likewise, if we are decreasing compressive force, so decreased force, we're going to have decreased osteoblast activity and increased osteoclast activity. We said earlier that osteoclast, by way of enzymes and hydrochloric acid, can resorb and take away bone. And so in this case, all of this green color that we see here, this is the amount of bone that has been taken away, so via bone resorption. So now the bones have become weaker and thinner as a result of the taking away of this tissue. All right. So take a look at this image and see what you notice in terms of the difference. Right. So these are digits. These are the kind of distal parts of our fingers here. You should notice that the one on the left has a decreased, or not a decrease, but a decrease relative to the one on the right in cortical thickness. So this outer portion of the bone, on a radiograph like this, anything that you see as white is dense, is very dense, firm bone. Okay, very hard, dense bone, not porous, in other words. So here you see it's this thick. When you look at this one on the right, you notice it is extremely thick. This gray region, this is representing the thickness of the medullary cavity. So here you see it's this thick. If you look on this one on the right, it's extremely thin. Right. So this turns out to be the hand of a rock climber on the right and the hand of a non-rock climber on the left. And so if you think about rock climbing, you're continually putting compressive force on your digits. Following Wolff's Law, you're going to have an increase in osteoblast activity. You lay down more bone, you get this nice increased cortical thickness as a result of the activity versus somebody who does not do that. You still have some cortical thickness, but it is not to the extent that you see in somebody who participates in rock climbing or something like that. All right. Now we also see bone have different shapes and features based on the activity of things that are attached to them. All right. So if we look to the left, we have a Homo sapiens, so we see humans, and we see a temporalis muscle right here. This is one of our muscles of mastication. So in other words, one of the muscles of chewing. All right. Homo sapiens, us, we were able to produce a bite force of anywhere between 120 and 160 pounds per square inch, so 120 to 160 psi, right? We do not have a structure that we see over here to the right in a gorilla skull, something called a sagittal crest or a midline sagittal crest. So notice on this gorilla skull, you see this large flared region of bone. All right, this is called a midline sagittal crest. This midline sagittal crest increases the surface area for their temporalis muscle to attach to. All right, so you can imagine if you have more surface area for the temporalis to attach to, you're going to be able to have more leverage. You're going to be able to produce more force with the muscle. And so it turns out that a gorilla can produce a bite force of 1300 psi. So they can go, or they can have a bite force of approximately 10 times that of us, of Homo sapiens. All right. So you can see this, how far superiorly the temporalis muscle goes on a human versus a other primate, right? So versus a gorilla. You go up all the way to this midline sagittal crest in this Australopithecine, so in this gorilla. And here you see it does not make it all the way here, so there's less attachment, there's less leverage. So by virtue of that, you get less force in the bite. Okay, so all this to say, bony attachments matter. Bony attachments matter in terms of the amount of force that you can produce. And then likewise, like we talked about here, the force that you do produce and the force that you do put um, on a bone can influence the reshaping, or what we'll call the remodeling of the bone. Okay. All right, so we're going to stop here and we'll pick up with the next part 4, I believe, by talking about the actual structure of compact bone, and we'll look at something known as the osteon.